Before you listen, if you enjoy the stories and want to hear more, then please consider subscribing. Most of you listening aren't subscribed, so please take this time to subscribe. Turn on notifications so you'll never miss a story and be the first to hear. You'll also be supporting me. Thank you. I'll never forget the day I took that flight from California to New York. Now picture this, it started like any other travel day. The usual frantic packing, double checking of passports, and the inevitable mad dash to the airport. Little did I know that this trip would be far from ordinary. Once I boarded the plane and settled into my seat, I noticed an old lady sitting next to me. There was something off about her, though I couldn't quite put my finger on it at first. She had a blind eye, and her frail body seemed to be burdened with the weight of countless years. But it wasn't just her appearance that made me uneasy. There was an air of sadness and awkwardness surrounding her that seemed to infect the entire row. As the plane took off and we ascended into the sky, the old lady beside me seemed to grow more and more uneasy. Her labored breathing grew increasingly ragged, and she shifted in her seat, clutching the armrests with frail, trembling hands. I tried to ignore the growing discomfort that her presence instilled in me and focused on my book, but my thoughts kept drifting back to her. Throughout the flight, the old lady's behavior became more erratic. At times, she muttered to herself, her words a barely audible whisper that I couldn't quite decipher. Occasionally, she'd reach out and touch her blind eye, her gnarled fingers tracing the milky surface with a mixture of fascination and revulsion. During the in-flight meal, she barely touched her food, pushing it around her tray with a shaky fork before finally giving up and closing her eyes. Her breathing steadied somewhat as she slept, but even in slumber, she seemed restless, her face contorted in a grimace of pain or fear. I attempted to distract myself by watching a movie on the in-flight entertainment system, but my attention kept wandering back to the old lady. Was she suffering from some kind of illness? Did she have any family waiting for her in New York? The questions gnawed at me, and I found myself growing increasingly concerned for her well-being. As we began our descent into New York, the old lady stirred in her seat. She opened her good eye and stared blankly ahead, her expression vacant and distant. It was as if she was looking through the plane into some unseen world that only she could perceive. The hair on the back of my neck stood on end, and I couldn't help but feel that something was deeply wrong with the situation. The hours ticked by, and the old lady's condition appeared to deteriorate. I decided that once we landed, I'd inform a flight attendant of her situation so that she could receive medical attention. It was the least I could do, after all. Upon landing in New York, I quickly made my way to a flight attendant and explained my concerns about the old lady. The flight attendant's expression shifted from professional concern to confusion and then disbelief. She insisted that there was no one seated next to me during the flight, that the seat had been empty the entire time. Confused and slightly unnerved, I insisted that I had not imagined the old lady. But as I scanned the faces of the disembarking passengers, I couldn't find her. She had seemingly vanished into thin air. Surprised and gobsmacked, I exited the plane and made my way to my hotel, trying to make sense of what had happened. Upon arriving at my hotel room, I tried to put the strange events of the day behind me. But as I unpacked my suitcase, I saw a figure in the corner of my eye, and when I turned to look, I caught a glimpse of an old lady, sort of like the old lady from the plane. My heart raced as I realized she had somehow followed me to my hotel room. Was this a demonic entity or a spirit of an elderly woman? Exhausted and terrified, I eventually fell into a fitful sleep. My dreams were filled with visions of the old lady, her one-eyed gaze piercing my soul as she whispered curses and threats that I couldn't quite comprehend. Her haunting presence invaded my every thought, leaving me with a sense of impending doom that was impossible to escape. I awoke the next morning drenched in sweat, the memories of my nightmare still fresh in my mind. I kept asking myself who that old lady is and why I suddenly kept seeing her. In the days that followed, I tried to go about my life, exploring the city and fulfilling my obligations. But the old lady's presence lingered, a shadow that I couldn't escape. I saw her in crowded streets and quiet corners, her blind eye always watching, always waiting. The fear that had taken root within me began to manifest in strange ways. I found myself inexplicably drawn to stories of curses and supernatural phenomena, seeking answers to the questions that plagued me. What was the old lady's curse, and what did it mean for me? I still can't believe that there was no one sat next to me. I still feel like it was a prank by the flight attendants. But the events that took place shortly after proved otherwise. I haven't seen her after my New York trip, and I am thankful for that. It all began with a family meeting in our cozy living room. My parents' younger brother and I sat around the coffee table, armed with maps, guidebooks, and a sense of adventure. Our mission: to plan the ultimate road trip that would take us across the country, exploring hidden gems and experiencing the natural beauty that our homeland had to offer. The weeks leading up to the trip were filled with anticipation and excitement. We researched and debated about every single stop, fine-tuning the itinerary to make sure we have the perfect balance of relaxation, sightseeing, and good old-fashioned family bonding. We even held multiple packing sessions, ensuring we had everything we needed for the journey ahead. When the day finally arrived, we waved goodbye to our home, our hearts filled with joy and optimism. The first few days were nothing short of magical. We cruised through charming towns, each with its own unique character and history. We snapped countless photos at breathtaking viewpoints, feasted on local delicacies, and soaked up the sun while driving down seemingly endless highways. But on the fourth day, as if fate had a twisted sense of humor, the skies turned dark and foreboding. What started as a light drizzle quickly escalated into a relentless downpour. The rain was so heavy that it became nearly impossible to see more than a few feet in front of us. Concerned for our safety, we decided to reroute our journey and seek shelter until the storm passed. And that's how we found ourselves on a narrow, winding road that led deep into a vast, ancient forest. As soon as we entered, it felt as if we'd stepped into another realm altogether. The trees were so tall and dense that they formed a canopy that blocked out most of the remaining daylight. The forest floor was covered in a thick layer of wet leaves, and a dense fog hung in the air, giving the whole place an eerie, otherworldly atmosphere. Despite the unsettling ambiance, we continued to drive deeper into the forest, our only goal being to find some semblance of shelter from the torrential rain. The silence inside the car was palpable, as each of us secretly battled our growing discomfort. The road twisted and turned, revealing nothing but more trees and darkness as the storm raged on. Suddenly, our trusted station wagon sputtered and came to a halt. My dad tried everything he could to get it started again, but the engine refused to cooperate. We were stranded in the heart of the forest with no idea how to get out. Panic began to rise, but we tried our best to stay calm and rational. As we sat there, the only sounds were the raindrops pelting against the car and the distant rumble of thunder. It was then that we heard it for the first time, a high-pitched, spine-chilling laugh that seemed to echo through the trees. The sound was so unexpected and unnerving that we all froze, our eyes darting around in search of its source. We tried to brush it off, telling ourselves that it must be some animal or a strange trick of the wind. But as the laughter continued, growing louder and more maniacal, it became impossible to ignore. It felt as if the forest itself was alive, its eerie cackle taunting us for daring to enter its domain. Desperate to escape, my dad gave the engine one more try, and by some miracle, it roared back to life. Without a second thought, we sped off down the winding path, the haunting laughter never far behind. It felt as though we were being pursued by an unseen presence, the shadows of the trees seeming to reach out and grab us as we drove. It felt like an eternity before we finally emerged from the forest and found ourselves on the outskirts of a small town. Relief washed over us as we spotted a rundown motel, its neon sign flickering in the darkness. It wasn't a glamorous place to stay, but it didn't matter. All we wanted was to escape the nightmare that had unfolded in the forest. We checked in and huddled together in our dingy room, the sound of the rain outside providing a grim soundtrack to our thoughts. Sleep was elusive, our minds filled with the haunting laughter and shadowy figures that had plagued us throughout the night. The following morning, we gathered our courage and shared our harrowing experience with the motel owner. His face grew pale as he listened, and he hesitantly told us a story that had circulated among the locals for decades. Years ago, a group of friends ventured into the forest for a camping trip. During their stay, one of them began to act strangely, claiming he heard voices and saw disturbing shadows in the darkness. Eventually, he snapped, attacking his friends while laughing maniacally. The surviving campers managed to flee and alert the authorities, but when they returned to the scene, the crazed man had vanished without a trace. The legend claimed that the man's spirit still haunted the forest, driven mad by the unseen forces that had tormented him. His chilling laughter echoed among the trees, serving as a warning to those who dared to enter the forest's depths. We thanked the motel owner for sharing the story and hastily continued our road trip, scared and troubled, but determined to salvage the remainder of our vacation. We avoided any mention of forests and stuck to well-traveled routes, trying to put the terrifying experience behind us. Despite the lingering fear, the rest of our journey was filled with beautiful moments. Stunning sunsets over sprawling landscapes, impromptu picnics in lush meadows, and encounters with warm-hearted locals who welcomed us with open arms. The memories we made during the remainder of the trip helped to soothe the wounds left by our night in the forest, but the scars would never completely fade. After a long day at work, all I could think about was getting home, taking a hot shower, and sinking into my bed. It was one of those days when nothing seemed to go right, and my mood was sour, to say the least. I walked up to my old trusty bike, which was chained to the rack outside my office building. The cool evening breeze hit my face as I unlocked it and started pedaling towards home. My usual route involved cycling through the bustling city streets, weeding in and out of traffic, and navigating the maze of pedestrians. But on this particular night, I remembered a shortcut I heard about from a coworker. He mentioned a small park nestled between the buildings that could save me at least 10 minutes on my commute. I figured it was worth a shot, especially considering the day I'd had. As I approached the park, I'd noticed that the streets surrounding it were eerily quiet. The bright city lights seemed to dim, and the noise of the city faded into the background. The entrance to the park was a narrow, unlit path lined with tall trees. I hesitated for a moment, but convinced myself that the shortcut would be worth the temporary discomfort. As I cycled deeper into the park, the darkness seemed to swallow me up. The trees towered above, their branches intertwined to create a canopy that blocked out any remnants of light from the city. The only sounds were the crunching of leaves beneath my tires and the distant hum of the city, which seemed to grow fainter with each passing minute. After a few minutes of cycling, I realized that I should have reached the other side of the park by now. I stopped and pulled out my phone, hoping to use the map app to guide me, but to my dismay, the screen remained blank, as if the battery had died. The frustration and exhaustion from my day began to bubble up, but I knew that panicking wouldn't help my situation. I decided to keep cycling, hoping that I'd eventually find an exit or some sort of landmark to help me get my bearings. But as I continued pedaling, I realized that the park seemed to be playing tricks on me. Every path I took led me back to the same spot, a small clearing with a lonely, withered oak tree at its center. No matter how hard I tried, I couldn't seem to escape this never-ending loop. As the night wore on, my anxiety grew. The once comforting silence of the park had transformed into an oppressive weight, pressing down on me and making it difficult to breathe. The shadows cast by the trees seemed to morph and twist, turning into sinister, elongated shapes that danced just outside my peripheral vision. My heartbeat quickened, and my legs grew heavy with fatigue, but I couldn't stop cycling. I knew I had to find a way out of this park before I lost my mind. Hours passed, and the park remained unchanged. No matter how fast or how far I cycled, I always ended up back at that same clearing with a twisted oak tree. The darkness had become my prison, and with each passing moment, I felt my sanity slipping away. I began to feel as though some unseen force was watching me, reveling in my torment and guiding me deeper into the labyrinth of trees and shadows. Just as I was about to give up hope, a faint glow appeared on the horizon, signaling the approach of dawn. The inky darkness of the park gradually gave way to soft shades of gray, and the sinister shapes that had haunted me throughout the night retreated to the safety of the shadows. As the first rays of sunlight pierced the canopy of leaves, the park seemed to release its grip on me, and I found myself standing in a familiar path. Exhausted and confused, I couldn't believe that time had flown by so quickly. It felt like I had been cycling for only a few minutes, but in reality, I had been trapped in the park for hours. Funny because so much for the shortcut. The sky had transformed from the inky black of night to the soft hues of dawn, and then, before I knew it, the dusk had arrived. The rapidly changing colors of the sky were a disconcerting reminder of the time I had lost in the park. As I finally exited the park, my legs felt like they were made of lead, and my mind was a whirlwind of confusion and disbelief. The streets surrounding the park were once again bustling with activity, and the bright city lights seemed almost blinding after spending so much time in the darkness. I cycled the rest of the way home in a daze, my thoughts consumed by the strange events that had unfolded in the park. The questions raced through my mind. How had I managed to get lost in such a small park? Why had time seemed to pass so quickly, leaving me disoriented and bewildered? and most importantly, what unseen force had held me captive within the confines of the park, forcing me to cycle in circles for hours on end. The more I pondered these questions, the more I began to feel as though I had been the victim of some supernatural phenomenon, a plaything for a malevolent entity that had reveled in my torment. The thought sent shivers down my spine and left me questioning the nature of reality itself. Safe to say, I stuck with my previous cycle route.
Because of you amazing people, we hit 1,000 subs. Thank you for supporting me. Why not join the family if you haven't already, and like and subscribe for more. Thank you.